What is up, Bitcoiners? I am sitting here with my boy, BranBTC, and we just had a fantastic conversation with Pierre Rochard, or I should just say Bran had a fantastic conversation with Pierre Rochard. I did not sit in on this quick chat, but Bran and Pierre talked about the Stable Act, and Pierre let it all off his chest. And so, yeah, I guess I'll let you jump into what you thought of the conversation, but I really thought it was a fantastic take on kind of a lot of commotion on Twitter.
Yeah, totally. Well, what's up, everybody? It's BranBTC. Yeah, just had a great convo. Really a great listen to Pierre because he just went. I mean, he had so much insight. So he brought really just a whole new perspective on this Stable Act and what it how it fits in kind of our societal conversation. And so, we talked historically. We talked about, what is our right as a government, as a people, in terms of who issues money. I mean, we really dove into some of the minutia of what this means for us as human beings. And I think that's the conversation that was kind of left out when we were just all focused on a couple people tweeting about this article or this bill, is we didn't think about, where should we put our foot down and what is it that we should be fighting for? And so I thought it was a great conversation.
And I guess just to take a quick step back before we get into the interview, Pierre and a lot of Bitcoiners have been responding to a bill called the Stable Act, which is, intended or on paper intended to, regulate stablecoin issuance. But under the cover, under the hood, it was a very, very broad bill, and the people who wrote the bill, kind of going on Twitter defending themselves, really demonstrated that they thought that it had broad-reaching powers, and were willing to, push those broad-reaching powers in order to enforce the concept that they're trying to, create with the bill. I mean, did I kind of give that background, do that justice?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the biggest point of this really is that the bill is so broad, no one really knows exactly how it would look like if it were to be put into law. I mean, it could do anything from require every single entity that operates in some sort of non-bank, non-dollar denominated asset, but like that's tied to the dollar. So, think your Venmo balance, would that apply to them? Maybe, maybe not. Would it apply to PayPal? Maybe, maybe not. There are so many aspects of it that are just unclear. And I think that's really what we tried to explain in this show, is that, this bill was in a lot of ways like a cannon shot. I mean, it was very broad. It was not highly targeted, but it has wide ranging impact. And I think that that's just, it's crazy to think that such a incredibly, consequential bill could be put forward with such impunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of is the impunity that I think got Pierre really worked up. Before we get into the actual show, let me just give a quick shill to our sponsors. It's Level. Level is a new Bitcoin banking service. It's not an exchange where it's designed like a brokerage. It is a Bitcoin first and native bank. So you can put your paycheck in there. They're not there yet, but they want to get to the point where you could be making money in fiat and depositing it into your FDIC insured Level bank account and turning whatever percentage of that every single month into cold hard BTC. So you could get paid in Bitcoin if you want to with Level. That's lvl.co. They are backed by Jimmy Song, Willie Woo, Anthony Papagliano, and several others, and they're really trying to make another take on Bitcoin banking. So check them out if this sounds exciting to you. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, as these regulators try to stamp down on innovation, companies, businesses, projects are innovating with Bitcoin endlessly. And we'll see who has the upper hand. And without further ado, let's just get right into the podcast with Pierre and BranBTC.
Excited to chat about the Stable Act. This has been probably dominating a lot of people's mind share recently after it came out. I guess it was what, a week and a half ago now, 2 weeks. I don't know how long ago it was.
Yeah, a short while ago, but yeah, I agree. It's been preoccupying a lot of people. Now, obviously, Bitcoin has a news cycle, right? And who would understand the Bitcoin news cycle better than Bitcoin Magazine? And this story seems to be sticking around, and I think that it's because the authors of it are out there on Twitter. From my perspective, digging themselves into a hole. From their perspective, they are, highlighting why they feel they're justified in proposing this legislation, and why this legislation, in their eyes, is for the common good. And I actually think that it's really great that in 2020 we're getting this level of transparency, right? Where we're able to interact directly on Twitter with the authors of a bill and be able to engage with them in the public square, and get up on our soapbox. And that's to Jack Dorsey's credit, right? Criticism of Twitter abounds. Nevertheless, Twitter has emerged as a fairly efficient clearinghouse of human communication. We're able to, be able to disseminate information globally from around the world fairly quickly, and engage in the marketplace of ideas, right? Put forth arguments in favor of policies or against policies, and do so in a really democratic manner. It's really amazing what Jack Dorsey has built.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And, Twitter's become a necessary tool, especially for us as a media company, to be able to, just reach out to people and interact without having such a high barrier to entry, like, having to dig around, find contact info, all that kind of stuff. So 100% agree. But let's talk then about this Stable Act, and kind of, could you walk us through kind of what does this thing do? What is it for? What does it mean?
Yeah, so really what we should look at, in my view, is this Stable Act in the context of monetary reform, right? This is a monetary reform act. It's not the first one that's been proposed. Many before it have been proposed. Many of them have passed. Really, in terms of the American experiment of self-governance, there's a rich history of monetary events and cycles throughout American history, and also kind of government defaulting on its obligations, to put it bluntly, in the sense that if we go back to the first Coinage Act, I should mention, the reason that this bill is in front of us at all, or has been proposed in the House of Representatives, is because the federal government, in the Constitution, it says that Congress has broad authority with regards to coinage, right? So let's keep in mind, when the Constitution was written, people talked about coinage, and so it's a little old-timey, but they're talking about money, and Congress can just regulate money. It's a very broad provision in the Constitution, and it reflects the ideology of the time, which is that money is a sovereign matter. It's not one of individual rights, where anyone can just do whatever they want with money. And we could talk about history of coinage before the U.S. Constitution and going back before, but I also I don't want to lose the focus that we're working towards an analysis of this bill that's being proposed, which is that essentially governments defaulted on gold and silver. Although in the United States, they defaulted on silver and then gold. The U.S. dollar started out as an amount of silver, not of gold. So if the government was actually honest, we would still be on silver. And the reasons for defaulting, right? It's this long series that finally ended with Nixon, severing all ties to gold in 1971. This really was about politics. It wasn't about good public policy. It wasn't about what is best for the common good. It was about political expedience and kind of the fiscal problems that government ran into, and the consequences of its bad monetary policies in the past. And really, the problem with severing the link between fiat currencies and gold or silver is that at that point, you're just saying that all money is debt, right? Because the dollar is just a liability that is issued by the Federal Reserve. And in a free society, any entity is allowed to issue liabilities. Any entity. On whatever terms are accepted by the counterparty, right? The party on the other side of the liability who sees this as an asset. And so there is kind of a natural right to tell your neighbor, I owe you $1 on demand. You can come ask me for $1 at any time. It would, I think it would be seen as a violation of freedom of speech for the government to say that is a regulated banking activity and that person needs to go to prison. And yet that's the framework that the authors of this proposed bill have established, is that anyone who says, hey, $1 payable on demand, here's the liability I'm issuing. Anyone who utters those words or, anything that could be interpreted in those words, they are performing a regulated banking activity and all of that entails, right? Which, it's the authors of the bill, they see it as a way of preventing counterfeiting. And the reason that they see these liabilities as counterfeiting is because there's not actually any real money anymore, right? There's no gold or silver. So really, it's just everyone is just creating liabilities. And it used to be that counterfeiting was about the actual coins, right? Of saying, hey, you said there was silver, but there's no silver. That was counterfeiting back in the day. But today, counterfeiting, because money has been dematerialized, counterfeiting today is free speech. And so at this point, this didn't really become self-evident until we actually saw digital technology that was good at solving the problem of counterfeiting, right? Of cryptography. And governments, so I don't know, I could stop here because I could just go on infinitely, but yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting. And, it's a very broad lens that you're looking at this through. And that brings like a really interesting perspective that I feel like too many of us are kind of focused just on what does this bill say and not as much on, why was this bill purported to have been written? So
the purpose of this bill is to reestablish the government's monopoly on USD, right? And the reason they have to reestablish that is indeed because the people have freedom of speech. So whenever people start saying, hey, I've got USD here payable on demand, they start calling it shadow banking, right? And so anytime that there's good liquidity, they immediately think it's shadow banking. And to them, the reason that they want to stamp it out is because they want to concentrate the power of the state. They want to be able to have full control over monetary policy, not partial control or indirect control via just interest rates. They're very unsatisfied with their current toolkit, the Keynesians. They've got interest rates. Okay, so get them negative, whatever. They've got QE, so They've bought all the treasuries. They've turned the treasury market into, a real, treasuries today are cash, right? Treasuries are USD today. So treasury has been fully monetized. The stock market, I think, has been partially monetized, by writing the puts, the implicit puts, the moral hazard, and then also the rest of the debt markets, right? And so in any case, there's lots of people creating lots of stores of value, and it really is about, they let the genie out of the bottle, right? They're the ones who decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to write a book that says there's an infinite amount of money, right? They wrote that in, I think Stephanie Kelton's book. She wrote that in there.
Yeah, well, we're both laughing here because like it's so clear and obvious. Like this is the end goal, right? Is what you're saying right here.
So then it's like, all right, well, so why is it a problem when normal people create USD, right? If there's an infinite amount of USD and so it's just a measuring stick, right? All we're talking about is people just measuring value between each other, right? In peer-to-peer, whatever. So it's not so much that Stephanie Kelton thinks that there's an infinite amount of USD. She thinks that the government has the right and the kind of equilibrium or optimal arrangement. Like, it is best for the economy if the government can create as much money or as little money as it wants to, but it is bad for the economy if it's anyone else. If it's anyone else, then it's a problem, and they need to be controlled by the government, because ultimately only politicians should be allowed to benefit from seigniorage of, hey, we're just going to print more money now. And so the politicians, they want that money to have value. They want it to be scarce, right? They want a high stock to flow ratio for fiat. The problem is that they fall into the temptation, right? They end up just printing more. And also, interestingly, in a lot of modern economies, the commercial banking system is another way by which the government emits money, right? Whether that commercial banking system is owned by the government or if it's privately owned, both systems have existed, and whenever banks lend out fiat, they're creating money. And the MMT people agree with this, and so really the system they want is that anyone who wants to emit money has to become a bank, so that they are an extension of the state, and that way they are able to. Now, what does that give them, right? One would ask, what's the purpose of this crazy authoritarianism? How do they benefit from this? They benefit from this because that allows them to inflate more, right? Because they're able to put very draconian capital controls, currency controls on all of these financial assets. They're able to, in a finely tuned manner, alienate people from their money, right? Alienate people from their assets, and steal. And we actually saw this just happen in Argentina. In Argentina, they imposed a wealth tax, and they said, hey, if you have more than this, in your bank account, we're going to take it. And that happened in Cyprus too. And so ultimately, they want all of the money to be in their walled garden, so that at the drop of a hat, they can go and take all of the money from everyone if that is what is politically expedient, right? And
that does feel like the end game.
Yeah, that's totalitarian, right? And so free people have a moral responsibility to push back against this. And I actually, I have a lot of hope and faith that, everyone in the United States especially, but I know that abroad as well, there's a broad coalition of centrists, classical liberals, even I would argue most progressives should find what I'm describing to be rather repulsive, and I think that they do. And I think that the position of MMT, it's only a position that's held by a handful of people in the world, and they just happen to have a megaphone on Twitter and be able to spew their BS and make legal threats against other people, without any repercussions for themselves, without attaching any liability to their threats of state-sponsored violence against people. they're able to propose bills like this. And so I think that this bill ultimately won't pass the House of Representatives because Democrats don't want to be associated with financial fascism. It's not a good look, right? And I think that Republicans, if anything, they're sympathetic to the argument that too much USD has been printed, and it's been to the benefit of government and at the expense of savers. And so, but I also think that a lot of people, a lot of Democrats and a lot of progressives and liberals, they also see that this is about freedom, which I think is a bipartisan value in the United States. I think that both sides say that they stand for freedom, right? That's they have different conceptualizations of how that applies in different scenarios. In this scenario, it's rather clear, right? Where you have someone essentially arguing for, abolishing the First Amendment, abolishing free speech, and establishing a surveillance society that is really to the detriment of everyone, ultimately, because, okay, we're happy that President Biden is in office next year, maybe. But it's not like that means Trump can't get elected in 4 years again for a second term, So do we want to give him a turnkey authoritarian financial system that would allow him to finance, creating a military dictatorship in the United States? No, I think that we should go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And, two things that you mentioned that I just wanted to add and maybe clarify is one, when we talk about what this bill does, it forces stablecoin issuers to become a bank, but not just a bank, a national bank.
That's one interpretation of the act, of the proposed bill. My interpretation of it, and, I'm not a Supreme Court justice, but I feel like I've taken a couple of law classes in college, so that's the extent of but I kind of just read it as a layperson, right? And my interpretation of it was that it's extremely broad, because basically they can define anything to be what they consider to be a payment system. And that's the wording in there, is payment system, right? They say it can be a government currency, or it can be a money with a payment system. And so with that very broad definition, any reasonable judge could look at that bill and say, well, yeah, it applies to Bitcoin. And so what does that mean in practice? That means that running a Bitcoin full node is a regulated banking activity. And so under federal law, what should happen is that, officers armed with assault rifles should blow down your front door, shoot your dog, and seize your Bitcoin node, right? That's what that law could be reasonably interpreted as written.
And this is what you were going back and forth with Rohan on Twitter about a little bit, right?
Yeah, he doesn't want to respond to that because he knows that I'm just calling out his Trojan horse. I'm just pointing out, hey, there's like a massive effing army inside of that horse. Let's light it on fire. Let's burn it at the gate, right? And let's punish these people. And so my stance now is that what we need is to pass a constitutional amendment that protects Bitcoin. And, we can debate about how it should be worded, but if people like Rohan think that they can go on Twitter and threaten us, I do think that we should have a cogent response so that we can really make sure that going forward, their threats are hollow, right? That we know that they're just not going to win because this is a constitutionally protected right that is specifically enumerated. And that way we can go about living in peace and tranquility. Now, they're trying to prop up their shitcoin, right? The USD. They just want to print more of it. They want higher inflation. I get it. But that doesn't mean that they can just start violating human rights to make that happen, right? We all want our investments to do well. whether it's USD or Bitcoin, I'm not out there pointing a gun at people, telling people to buy Bitcoin. I would never do that. I really would never do that. And it's disappointing that Rohan would do that.
Yeah, totally. And one thing that strikes me is kind of reminding me of is I think in sort of the language around when they announced this act, this bill, they were saying that what they're trying to do is protect the minorities and the downtrodden from being involved in like this predatory landscape, and instead making sure that they were protected by the legacy financial institutions that have protected them so well up until this point. And I just thought that was such an interesting cognitive dissonance to like, try and purport that everything that we've had works so well for poor and for, the downtrodden, and that these new innovations are only seeking to exploit and to, hurt them even more. I just thought that was so interesting.
Yeah. So I do think that they are very defensive on this because they understand that, let's call it crypto, right? Broadly, crypto is democratizing money. It's democratizing finance. It really represents the best of human ingenuity, of cooperation, of community, of people coming together for a higher purpose. It's arguably a religion, right? People say Bitcoin's a cult all the time. So Rohan, he belongs to his own cult, right? The cult of the USD. And that's fine as well. I just don't think that the state should use violence against belief systems, essentially, which Bitcoin is. And the other part of it is that they know the evil that gets committed by fiat. They know it, right? They know that this is what finances really war at awful scales. Weapons. It's funny, we hear people on the left broadly, and some people on the right as well, say that, hey, there shouldn't be weapons of war in the streets of the United States. There shouldn't be assault rifles in the streets, in our streets. Meanwhile, they have tanks on the streets of Fallujah. So they know that this fiat has financed a lot of injustice in the world, and it's financed atrocities. Both sides, really. If you look at throughout history, many conflicts have been financed through the issuance of more fiat, namely World War I and World War II. So some of the most horrific events of human history were financed by their system. And they know that. And so when they go on Twitter, they have to talk about, in the most disingenuous and transparently hypocritical manner, talk about how this is good for the weak and the downtrodden. That us having more power, empowers other people. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It actually disempowers other people, and it concentrates power in centralized systems of politicians and bankers. And it's really, I see it as, and the other part that they also, I think, don't talk about as often as they should is how much inflation hurts the lower and middle classes. The reality is that rich people, the upper classes, their balance sheets are not in cash. They're invested in a variety of financial assets, of cash generating businesses, right? The equity of businesses. Mm-hmm. They're invested in real estate, fine art. So the wealthy have access to good investment opportunities, and that's part of what means that the wealthy get wealthier. And so they actually don't care about inflation because they have access to stores of value. They don't hold cash, right? So they're not affected by that 2% inflation. And actually, they're affected by other forms of inflation. But for them, as long as the value of their financial assets is doing well, they'll be able to afford their yacht. Now, the lower classes, they are renters. If you look at their balance sheet, they actually don't hold any significant assets other than cash. from paycheck to paycheck. So they get their paycheck, that gives them a certain cash balance. They spend it down. Then they get their next paycheck. They spend it down. Now, while they are living paycheck to paycheck, if you look at it from kind of a weighted average perspective, they're holding a cash balance day to day, right? A certain weighted average cash balance, and that's it. That's really the only material asset they have on their balance sheet, right? So they're 100% exposed to cash. So every little bit of inflation, every little bit of cash dilution, it hurts them far more than it hurts the wealthy. Far more. It impairs their ability to build up those first steps of saving, right? It's like, any person accumulating wealth, it starts with cash. It starts with holding money, and then eventually you're able to use that cash balance to finance an investment, and then or to start your own business, and then you can really, take off in terms of your net worth. But it always starts with cash. Now, obviously, everyone holds cash, even wealthy people hold lots of cash. But I'm really talking about, if you look at it as a percentage of your balance sheet, the less well off you are, the bigger of a percentage of your balance sheet it is. And so inflation is a very regressive tax. And it really is about stealing from Peter to pay Paul, right? Taking resources from one person to give them to another via the political process of allocating resources. And it's just really, it's quite an injustice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, we're running up a little bit on time, but I would be remiss if we didn't, kind of close out this very wide ranging, interesting conversation by noting kind of what could go down as maybe the tweet of the century, definitely the tweet of the year, which was Rohan talking about you have to accept that running an open blockchain network means you are at some level liable for the actions that take place on that network. Crazy thought, I know. To which you responded, if you vote and pay taxes, shouldn't you be held liable for mass incarceration and the invasion of Iraq? And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that and maybe give some closing thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea that anyone's participation, no matter how small, in an evil, right, a sin, or in an illegal act, no matter how small, you have a liability. Something's attached to you. So if we think about, no matter how small, running a Bitcoin node is really smaller than paying taxes, right? Because paying taxes, you're outright giving them resources to commit evil. Whereas when you're running a node, all you're doing is just verifying that they've broadcasted this transaction, right? That was transferring money to do evil. Mm-hmm. So it's the difference between, witnessing a crime is what happens on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So when you're running a node and there's an illegal action or an illegal transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain, your node is a witness to a crime. My understanding of Western judicial philosophy is that witnesses are not liable for the crime as a general matter, unless there's something else where they're really, maybe if they don't report the crime. So maybe Rohan could make an argument that if you run a Bitcoin node, you should report crimes, but I don't know how that would practically work at all. It seems like the most bizarre system ever. And it's really a stretch to say that you're helping very much by running a node. But nevertheless, Rohan's view is that no matter how small, you should be held liable. And the reality is that, unfortunately, so I really think that if we look at human history, the United States Constitution is the best legal document. It's defended liberty and property rights more than any other document in human history. However, unfortunately, humans are flawed. We're all flawed. We're all very, very, very flawed. So no matter how good our system is, if we look at the history of the United States and its relations throughout the world, there are many cases of us committing atrocities, whether it's the My Lai massacre in Vietnam or Abu Ghraib, in Iraq more recently. These are very real evils that were committed as part of the fiat system. They were committed by people paid in US dollars, employed by the federal government, which is also part of the Federal Reserve. So all of these people, by Rohan's theory of extensive or infinite liability, right? Of infinitely tangential liability as well, right? Because if you think about it, even if you go to an orange grove in Florida, this tree is going to pay taxes, right? Because ultimately the fruits of that tree are going to enter into commerce and they're going to pay taxes to the federal government. So really, even like from a vegan perspective, this means that all of the plants and animals in the United States that end up in our tax system are also guilty of evil, right? And so it's really, I find it amusing that he has such hatred towards Bitcoin that he's willing to just create a completely new theory of legal liability. And it really speaks to the extreme nature of modern monetary theory, of saying the government should have a monopoly over money, right? That's really what their policy advice is, to make sure that the government has a absolute monopoly over money. And as we know, that trying to reach that level of perfection, you've got to build a totalitarian society. You've really instituted something arguably worse than communism, right? In terms of how closely it controls the population, and arguably that's what China's going for. So I guess my advice to Rohan would be move to China. Okay, they're much more open to your ideas. Please move to China.
That's great. And that's a great way to kind of wrap it up. And the good news is here, we're pretty certain that this bill won't end up being law, but this does feel like kind of the first attempt at really reining in what shouldn't be reined in.
Yeah, I mean, we've just got to push in the opposite direction. We need to have them talking about our bills. What are we doing talking about their bills, right? So absolutely. I think that we need to see lawmakers who have been newly elected, like Senator-elect Loomis from Wyoming, or Warren Davidson. We need to be helping them in every way possible and encouraging them to propose legislation that I think would help secure American security. Okay, not to say that word twice, but really, I mean, I see these MMT people as that they're going to screw us over, right? Currently, the federal government has a large amount of Bitcoin. Okay, what we need to do is make sure the federal government, if we care about the federal government's continued existence, which I'm assuming Rohan does, they should not sell that Bitcoin. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, Pierre, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, we can find you on Twitter. Give us your handle.
At Pierre_Rochard.
And we'll find you at Kraken too. Thank you so much, Pierre.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.